We are ready for chapter 15, Christianity and the Formation of Europe. So, moving right along through time, we talked about some of those ancient cultures last time, and now we're moving on to the early Christian, which we also call Byzantine or Byzantium, the Middle Ages, which includes the art time periods of Romanesque and Gothic. So we're just going to jump right in. There's several key terms here that you'll want to be looking for as we go through the lecture today. I'll let you write those down. A basilica is like a cathedral or a church from this time period, and it has these different parts in it: the nave, the apse, the aisles, clerestory, the transept, and the nares. And then we're going to look at two different types of floor plans of churches, which would be the central and the cross church plan. Another term we go over is an icon. And an illumination. And then we'll talk about embroidery and tapestry briefly. Okay, so the rise of Christianity. We'll watch a video kind of as an introduction to this time period. But this chapter is going to focus on, as it says, the rise of Christianity in Western Europe and the arts of Byzantium. We have very little Christian art that survives. Christians were persecuted at this time, at the early time period, when Christianity was in its infancy. As you probably know from the Bible, the disciples and the early church was very dangerous for them, and Rome was still persecuting them. They had to hide. And so some of these, they actually would have churches, which we'll talk about later, church meetings and gatherings in underground catacombs and a system underground, like tunnels and caves and things, to be very secretive about their meetings, much like the persecuted church today in many parts of the world. But some of the art that we have from this time period is preserved in these underground tunnels and burial chambers. So we'll go ahead and watch the video, and then we can continue lecture from there.
Early Christian art began after Christ's death and lasted until 313 AD, when it took on a different form. Christianity was just beginning to sweep through the Roman Empire, and the movement was so powerful that it changed the face of Roman art and prompted artists to glorify the spiritual rather than human aspect of their work. Early Christian art emerged as the Roman Empire fell into decline. The new Christian religion gave the people of this fast-changing empire just the assurance they sought. What is surprising, though, is that the tenets of this new religion did not permit creation of representational imagery of the divine. However, early Christian artists found a way around the Old Testament's prohibition of religious images. Instead of prohibiting all religious imagery in art, they prohibited only the most idolatrous art form, sculptures, which could be viewed from all sides. Sculptures had been worshipped as idols in the past. Any sculpture that looked like a realistic three-dimensional saint or god was prohibited. But relief sculptures, paintings, and other mediums depicting religious imagery were allowed. This flexible interpretation gave Christians plenty of mediums and Christian themes to work with. An important thing to remember about early Christian art is that the artists of this time came from a wide variety of backgrounds and previous religious beliefs. There was no existing precedent for Christian art, so its style and imagery were completely new. This is one of the reasons that the art of this period is a combination of several different styles and draws from so many different cultures. You can spot traditional Roman symbolism and symbols of pagan worship in art from this period, alongside Christian imagery. The first examples of early Christian art come from the Roman catacombs. After non-Christian Romans began burying their dead instead of cremating them, Christian converts wanted to do the same in separate Christian catacombs. Traditional Romans buried their dead away from the cities, outside of the city walls, and Christians often built their own catacombs close by, mimicking the practice. Wealthy Romans decorated their loved one's final resting place, and these decorations provide our first glimpse into early Christian art. An art form that was common in the Roman catacombs was the fresco. In early Christian catacombs, fresco painters laid quickly stated brushstrokes, one on top of another without blending, which gave the paintings a more impressionistic than realistic style. Frescoes of early Christian symbols like the Good Shepherd, the dove, the phoenix, the fish, and the ornate or praying person adorn the catacombs of the San Callisto's walls. The catacombs of Saint Domitia are known for their arch-shaped frescoes of Jesus teaching 10 disciples. In this mural, Jesus wears white robes like a Roman orator, holds a scroll in his left hand, and extends his right hand like Roman speakers traditionally did. Classic Roman symbolism is applied to Jesus to communicate his wisdom and eloquence to people already familiar with this imagery. Wealthy Romans buried their dead in sarcophagi sculpted with elaborate mythological motifs. And wealthy Roman Christians maintained this tradition in their own commemorative art. Historical and mythological scenes and portraits, animals, and natural and architectural motifs covered all four sides of these ancient sarcophagi. Most Christian sarcophagi featured a blend of traditional Roman symbols and biblical scenes representing salvation, such as Daniel and the lion and Jonah and the whale. Interestingly, neither images of Jesus nor the crucifixion or cross were featured. Instead, Jesus was represented by more light-hearted, allegorical images such as the Good Shepherd, the peacock, the anchor, and the lamb. Early Christian sculpture was detailed, realistic, and proportional. However, one exception was the distortion of some figures' size to reflect their status. Important figures were enlarged and dwarfed their lesser-known counterparts, and a compositional style that placed smaller figures towards the bottom and larger figures towards the top. Because Christians were severely persecuted, the symbol of the cross was used as a sign of protection and a way for Christians to identify other Christians. However, because monotheism was not tolerated in an empire that required the worship of Roman gods, the cross symbol had to be hidden to maintain secrecy. Disguised crosses were cross symbols disguised as something else. Anchors, Egyptian ankhs, and the Chi Rho, the first two letters of Christ, interwoven to form a common Roman symbol. These were all early Christian symbols that can be found in catacomb murals and other art. Similarly, images or scenes depicting Jesus were practically non-existent. Instead, metaphors depicting Christ as well-loved Roman heroes and pagan gods like Apollo was done to some extent. Although the work tended to be ambiguous so as to throw off suspicion. Early Christian art is typically divided into two periods, before and after the Edict of Milan, which is when Roman Emperor Constantine made a decree favoring Christianity. After the Edict of Milan legalized Christian worship in 313, there was no need for the disguised symbolism of early Christianity. and the period of Byzantine art began. Christian art received a big impetus when Constantine himself commissioned the building of several churches, which had some stunning examples of Christian art in the form of colorful mosaics. These mosaics depicted scenes that would guide the faithful to righteousness. Early Christian churches were designed like previous Roman basilicas, with a few innovations to fit their new purposes. The churches and basilicas sponsored by Constantine commonly followed the five-aisle design or had a polygonal central shrine. Mosaics depicting scenes from the Old and New Testament drew visitors' gaze to the heavens and the first public places of worship for Christian followers. Early Christian artists used pre-existing symbols, inspirations from their own faith, and their own imaginations and ingenuity to create a new style that would endure throughout medieval times. Despite limitations and restrictions during the movement's initial years, these artists managed to express themselves, inspire their audience, and ensure that a strong connection between religion and art was forged for years to come.
So I hope you noticed in the video it mentioned that early Christian art is kind of divided into two periods. You have the before Constantine's edict to make Christianity legalized, and then after. So like it said in the previous slide, artworks from that time period before Constantine did that are very rare. We don't have very much. It was hidden because they were underground, so to speak, at that time period. But I think it's interesting to note, as we have this entire semester, art continues. It's still there, is it not? There's always this sort of underlying need of just humans, whether Christian or early ancient culture, to create art, to create some sort of visual representation of things, or in this case, to maybe be worship pieces or just inspirational pieces, as people were new to Christianity and feeling persecuted by that, but it's still there, the desire to create that. And it's very interesting in that earlier art that was under heavy persecution of the Romans, they found ways to make it work, didn't they? They found ways to disguise the cross as the early Christian symbol. They found ways to hide that in the fish symbol or the anchor symbol or the Egyptian symbol. And then it also mentioned that even Jesus would be represented sometimes as a Roman style. That one said Apollo. So, you kind of look at it and you're like, well, that's weird. The Christians were almost crossing over into pagan type representation. And I think this is just my take, is that it's so important for people to have visual that they kind of tried to overcome what barriers were in the way to do that. And so they needed some sort of visual of Jesus, and that's what they came up with. But yeah, just that early stuff is so influenced by the previous cultures around them, Greek and Roman influence, and others as well. So that was the early stuff, and there isn't very much to look at. The video showed you several examples of that early Christian art that, as they said, is primarily in the catacombs and burial chambers that were underground and preserved that way, but we don't have very much. So then this slide is talking about post-Constantine's edict. And so we have the rise of Christianity 313. Roman Emperor Constantine issued tolerance to all religions, and he moved the capital to Constantinople, from Rome to Constantinople. And we're going to jump here into Roman buildings and churches, which is a really important aspect of early Christianity and Roman influence in that. But it's not the only form of art there was. It's just a big part of it. So we kind of go into a branch of that, discussing all the different aspects of architecture. And there you have on your slide also a piece of, it's a sculpture of Constantine's head. He had a giant statue made of himself, and it was broken, and so you have the different parts, and there's his head. So early Christian churches were constructed in the style of a Roman building called a basilica. It consists of an apse, a nave, aisles, and clerestory. So here's the definition of what those things are, very brief definition. But you probably should go ahead and draw out that diagram there of a Roman basilica, if you can see what those different things are. You have the apse at the front, so right here. It's a rounded thing. This is the front of it. This is where the altar would be, where the worship is pointed towards. Then you have the nave, which is this wide open part in the middle. You have passageways or aisles here on the side. So these could be sort of like, they could be open with pillars and just ways to walk through, or it can be almost like more like rooms and walls on the sides. And then we call this the clerestory, is the upward extension pierced with windows. So we don't see that from this view. This is an overview, bird's eye view looking down like a floor plan. But if you could see it from the side, which we will in a moment, you can see these windows that would be all along the top of the building. Of course, to let light in and to kind of have an upward feel, a heavenly spiritual feel to the church. And from the beginning, you know, these Christian churches, Christianity emphasizes worship together, people coming together to worship the Lord and congregate. And so these buildings are made for congregational worship, for many people to come together. Not so much true of earlier works that were Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian temples. They were more for worshiping the God in a spot or individually, perhaps you could say. But these are just a different type of structure that was needed. Lots of space for people to gather together. Okay, so then we have the church is starting to change just a little bit, becoming their own thing just a bit. So a transept and a nares were also added to the Christian architecture to form the basic vocabulary of a church. The transept is just this piece right here. So it creates these extensions that go out perpendicular to the nave. And what that forms is a cross plan. So make sure you have that in your notes, that this is what a cross plan looks like, where you have a small cross in there, if you can see it. Notice that the apse or the altar is much smaller now. It's the focal point still within the church. It's where all of the worship and focus goes, is to this point, but it's not the entire end of the building now. We have this transept piece that's been added. You still have the aisles, you still have the nave, you still have the nares, but now we have a new piece added to the front. We have an atrium. And I'm seeing if the next slide has a... The atrium, I don't really have that listed as a vocab word here, but the atrium is, as you might guess, like an open garden area. So this is actually showing the basic layout of Old St. Peter's Cathedral. And it was in Rome, and it burned, so it was no more. And then they built a second St. Peter's Cathedral. So we call this one the Old St. Peter's. And then, so of course, this is where you would go in, these front doors. Then you have the atrium, and then you would go into the cathedral itself. And then we have the next diagram will show you a comparison of that old Roman basilica next to this Old St. Peter's Cathedral, or church, I should say. I think they call it Old St. Peter's Church. And then a side view too. So once you get these words down, if you didn't get this totally sketched, it's on this next slide as well. Okay, here it is. So here's the Roman Basilica again, like I showed you on the first slide. It has your apse, which is like the altar, the aisles and the nave. It also has an apse at this end, but that is more just because of the shape of it. It's not where the altar was. Then you can see how it's changed a little bit. You get the nave, or the basic middle of the church, gets smaller, doesn't it? And then you have this atrium area. So like a gathering area just to be together, and congregational space. And then there is a side view of Old St. Peter's. You can see what we were talking about here. With the tall ceiling, and you have these windows on the sides, making what we call the clerestory. Oops, sorry. And so that's what these windows here create. Then you have these side rooms here on the side, which we call the aisles. But as you can see, these are columns all through here. So it's open space, but it does create like aisles. And from what I can tell, you have like seating in these aisle things for worship and in the front, but you don't, it seems like they keep this space open. And again, this is the one that burned. But it's hard to even see the similarity between these two. Things got changed around quite a bit as they developed their need for the church building itself. So what is Byzantium? Now, this is really after the time period of when Constantine issued his edict. As this says, Byzantine rulers viewed themselves as the continuation of the Roman Empire. Artworks combined images of earthly power and splendor with oneness based in Christian iconography. So you have a lot of Mary and cross and fish. It's really just like a blend of this Roman Empire and how those rulers still saw themselves as godlike, but then they're mixed with this Christian, this new Christian faith and accepted religion. And so it's kind of a weird time period because you just start to see, you can see what we know of the Bible, like what we know of the stories and the early church, but yet you've got this strong Roman influence in it as well. So Byzantium is kind of its own art period. We talk about early Christianity art, that's a time period. And then we have Byzantium as being a time period of art. And also, remember I mentioned it, that Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople. So that created this kind of whole eastern part of the Roman Empire. And so we'll just watch this video, and that will explain some of that more in depth.
The medieval period, or the Middle Ages, spans almost 1,000 years. Between 400 new art genres were created. Different artistic traditions were meshed, including styles from the Middle East and Africa. And notable artists created some stunning masterpieces that would inspire the early Renaissance. The medieval period encompassed 8 major artistic movements, which include Byzantine, Islamic, Viking, Carolingian, Celtic, Ottonian, Romanesque, and Gothic art. The Middle Ages were also a time when Christianity was flourishing across Europe, and this meant a rejection of older pagan ways of life. Roman Emperor Constantine gained many followers after his public proclamation that Christianity, a religion which had been heavily persecuted in its early years, would now be tolerated. Medieval art reflects the sweeping popularity of Christianity. The medieval era saw the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, which is one reason why Emperor Constantine moved the Roman capital from Rome to Byzantium, which we know as present-day Istanbul. Constantine's Byzantine Empire relied on the stability of the East while maintaining ample trade routes with the West. A new sect of Christianity, Catholicism, gained prominence in the West, but the artists of the region followed the lead of their Eastern Byzantine peers in terms of artistic style. One of the key points to remember about art of this age is that due to concerns about the Bible's prohibition of graven images, medieval artists avoided sculptures in the round, which could be viewed from all sides, such as Roman busts. Instead, artists tended towards one-dimensional and somewhat abstract art. During the decline of the Western Roman Empire, religious mosaics and frescoes made their appearances in medieval churches, cathedrals, and basilicas. Medieval art involved a fusion of Eastern and Western cultures, including Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The earliest medieval art, dating from 500 to 800 AD, is best known for the tessellated, or repeated patterns of Islam, and the Vikings' bejeweled migratory art. Islamic art reflected Muslim ideas of heaven as a natural paradise and featured many floral patterns, as well as repeated geometric forms and elegant calligraphy. The Vikings excelled in woodwork and metalwork, featuring interlaced patterns and abstract depictions of animals. As they were a migratory people, most of their art was portable. The Vikings are known for their fibulae, or golden brooches, and one of the most famous of these is the Ostrogothic golden eagle fibula, an abstract eagle brooch with a circular center and a geometric arrangement of precious gems. During the Carolingian period, between the late 8th and early 10th centuries, Emperor Charlemagne sponsored the construction of many extravagant churches and monasteries. He also lavished churches with gifts of liturgical items for use in Christian services, such as chalices, incense censers, and crosses made of gold and silver covered with pearls and gems. Although elaborate metal art had been common in the past, Charlemagne deliberately challenged the Byzantine iconoclasts of the late 700s by encouraging depictions of the human form, which could be viewed as idols in the liturgical art of his time. Charlemagne was also responsible for spreading literacy among nobles throughout his reign. He stressed the importance of books and reading, which had been neglected for many years, and his views led to the development of the popular Carolingian minuscule script. Illuminated manuscripts, or elaborately illustrated books, with covers made of precious metals and covered with jewels, were popular with monks in medieval times. The best known illuminated manuscripts come from Celtic artists who used many of the same designs found in their legacy of metalwork in the intricate knot-like paintings in their books. Wealthy families owned their own illuminated manuscripts, which were called the Book of Hours, and were used for their daily religious activities. As demand grew, artists were encouraged to show off their skills in creating these manuscripts, which were needed for universities and monasteries, as well as wealthy patrons. Geometric patterns from Coptic Egypt and the Anglo-Saxon fascination with animal art began influencing Celtic style in the 7th century. Some of the best examples of early Middle Age art that we have today are found in illuminated manuscripts. The Book of Durrow, the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Ebbo Gospels are 4 of the best-known manuscripts. During the Ottonian period, named after King Otto the Great, and his son and grandson Otto the Second and the Third, the cultural revival that Charlemagne had spearheaded influenced new art that took on an increasingly Germanic style. By 1000 AD, Romanesque architecture had begun to gain followers in France and quickly spread all over Europe as cities and their monasteries gained more and more power and wealth. Romanesque architecture was characterized by semicircular Roman arches, thick stone walls, and separated spaces according to function. Cathedrals were bigger than ever before and were richly decorated with vibrant paintings and figurative sculptures. Relief work in these cathedrals tended to be bigger than ever before, and artists explored new ways to make them more and more imposing. Every church had impressive frescoes depicting religious scenes, and this became almost mandatory for churches and cathedrals of the day. Many paintings featured horrible monsters and beasts battling it out with heroes, or amongst themselves. By the early 12th century, Gothic art had emerged in France. Gothic art was more realistic than previous medieval styles, and it also incorporated striking and elegant new designs into traditional art, which made this new style distinctive and popular. One of the key changes was in architecture, where it brought the integration of sculpture into buildings, like saint-shaped pillars and angels floating on window frames. The new design that Gothic architects adopted allowed them to free up space for stained glass windows. As a result, some spectacular stained glass work was created and installed in many churches. The most common themes depicted the Virgin Mary and Christ Child motif. As 1300 AD drew to a close, leading medieval artists like Giotto began searching for a way to set their work apart from the older Byzantine style. As a result of these artists' experimentations, the Renaissance style, which produced such masters as Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and Raphael, was born.
So that video was kind of a overview of a lot of what we've talked about. It started with early Christian art in Byzantine, and it referenced a few things there. And then with Constantine and his making Christianity legal, and then eventually the official religion of the Roman Empire, and that he moved the capital to Constantinople, which was the eastern part of the empire. And so it started with that and kind of twined in Byzantine art, Byzantium, and then it went on into the Middle Ages. And so, you know, the way history is, nothing is just very stop and go. The end of a time period and the beginning of one, they kind of merge together. So that was a nice overview of this entire period that we're talking about. But just a little more specifics and a few examples of actual Byzantine art I want to show you before we go on and talk about the Middle Ages more specifically. So when you see artwork that's Byzantine. Remember, in both videos, it mentioned that sculptures in the round, as we talked about in our sculpture chapter, were kind of just, it's almost like they were too much on the verge of being idols for worship. And so that was pretty much not allowed in Christian art. They could do relief sculptures, as it said in both videos, but they couldn't do sculpture in the round. And then we also talked about how this art of both early Christian and Byzantine, you see sort of this mixture of Christian themes mixed with previous cultures and styles of those surrounding cultures. So things like you see Mary, the cross, the fish, Jesus, but you see it in a very Roman style. You do also see that artwork is more flattened and abstracted. Subjects express religious doctrines and beliefs. That is the primary subject matter. You don't see much else, right? You don't see just a random, think back to the Roman, when we were talking about Greek and Roman art. A lot of that was about gods or the emperors of the time, sculptures based on that. It wasn't on the theme of Christianity at all, obviously, because Christianity wasn't even there yet, and it was originally persecuted, outlawed. So this subject matter that you're about to see is all religious, clear through the Middle Ages. Now, I know that video talked about lots of other outside things, some Islamic influence, some Germanic influence, but the primary subject matter, even up through the Middle Ages, was Christianity. And an icon, there's your definition for icon, a specific kind of image, either a portrait of a sacred person or a portrayal of a sacred event. That is the technical definition of icon. So our first example for Byzantine art is this very famous mosaic. And if you recall what a mosaic is, it is tiny pieces of colored glass or tile, like ceramic tile, that's been arranged and then glued down and then grouted so that it's a very permanent, durable work of art. So if you could zoom in on this, really small, it's definitely not a painting. It is tiny pieces of glass or tile. I'm not sure which this one's made of. Probably ceramic tile, different colors of glaze to create all those different colors. This was a favored technique of this time period. And as we learned about, this is very much something that you would see in Roman art, this material, using mosaics. Even Greek and some of those islands like Crete and some of those early Mediterranean cultures did this sort of mosaic artwork. So definitely just continuing what they know, right? This is what they've been exposed to. This is what they saw. And so they did their Christian art in this same style. This is Empress Theodora and Ritune, 547. So just think about the time period that is. Christ died in 33 AD, right? Or he was 33 years old. There's a little bit of discrepancy in when AD started. But this is like 500 years post Christ. So we are definitely past early Christianity, several hundred years, and now we're in this Byzantine Empire. And this is also, I should mention, in the Church of San Vitel Ravana. It is a church that has the interior just many, many mosaics, including portrayals of Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora. The church was built under their patronage. Like the statue of Constantine we examined earlier, the images convey the ruler's symbolic presence in the distance portion of their empire. Mosaics continued to be a favored Byzantine technique. And we're going to look at the next one, which is a very famous mosaic of this time period. This is Christ as the Pantocrator. And so the previous date, let me click back, this was 547 AD. Now we're 1183. So we're 500 years later about. And this is just very traditional Byzantine style. We have, this is in Sicily. And Pantocrator, by the way, is Greek for ruler of all. A standard element of later Byzantine iconography, the Pantocrator image emphasizes the divine, awe-inspiring, even terrifying majesty of Christ as opposed to his gentle, approachable human incarnation as Jesus. And if you look below, you can see right below Jesus there at the top. But first of all, look at Jesus. Isn't he just kind of this looming? I mean, if you were standing in this church, it's a huge, almost terrifying image, I would say, of Jesus. It's just a very different depiction than maybe what we're accustomed to in Western art of Jesus as being just this gentle and peaceful looking. This has a little bit of a darker, scarier tone to it, which is just characteristic of this time period. But below, you see Mary holding the Christ child on her lap, and she has angels and saints around her. So you can just see how Byzantine artists are not creating in that very naturalistic, realistic way of Greece and Rome. It's more like this flattened, abstracted style, a little less realistic, right? And if I go back to this, which granted is 500 years earlier, you can see though that these are just very not realistic, almost cartoon-like, very simplified. Now, it's just interesting to think about it though, because that is intentional. That is the style of this time period. It's not because these artists couldn't draw or create things more realistic. Granted, they're using mosaic tile. That's not as easy, I wouldn't think, as just picking up a paintbrush and painting something. But think back to like the Roman sculptures that we looked at, like the married couple that we looked at that just showed expression and very realistic, soft edges, very naturalistic feeling. So this is definitely different than that earlier work. And I think part of it is the focus at this point anyway is on not this particular image, because this is actually an empress, but they are the patrons of this building. So that's why they got to be included in artwork in the building. This isn't the only artwork in that church. They would have had several religious scenes as well. This just shows the patrons, the person behind the building of it. But I think that the focus is on the spiritual, and so not so much, if that makes sense, like not so much expressing sensitivity and emotion. It's more about, it's kind of portraying Christianity in a serious light. Like, this is serious. It's not just a beautiful, whimsical image. So back to this one, which, as I said, is like 500 years later, still the same kind of tone. It looks different. Yes, it does look a little more naturalistic at this point, a little softer, not quite as cartoon-like, but pretty stiff at the same time. So yeah, these artists were just not really naturalistic. They are more flattened, more abstracted. It almost has like an Egyptian tone to it. Do you see that coming through when you look at these not so much Christ here, but these images, and even this one 500 years earlier, almost has like an Egyptian, very stiff feel to it. They are very embellished with gold, jewels, glamoury, glitzy looking. And I think that's it. Just all this detail through here, these very intricate patterns and details done, just an extreme elaborate skill, but then also just all the gold. That is obviously just heavenly splendor, right? It's trying to show this is a majestic, divine representation, not an earthly one. So hopefully you get the feel for Byzantine art through those. Now, a couple of architecture pieces. Byzantium had a lot of churches built, and those earlier images I showed you of an overview, those are early Christian and then definitely Byzantine as well. And this is where we get into this central church plan. It became the favored over the cross plan. I'm going to flip back and just show you, if you recall. This was, this is what we've already taken notes on. This was that Roman basilica, right? This would have been like kind of this real Roman influenced church. Very simple, very heavy, heavy stone building. This was Old St. Peter's, which had the many changes made to it, but one of the main things that structurally and looking at it was different was it had this transept, which created that cross plan. Okay, then those are early Christian. We get into more of this Byzantium time period, and you start to get this central church plan. I don't think I have a slide of an overview of what a central church plan looks like. But it's, we looked at this one before. This is actually Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which was originally built as a Christian church, and then when it was overtaken by Islam, became an Islamic mosque. And that's when we talked about earlier, that's when these things were added to it. But the building itself was originally a Christian church. So let's just read about why it was favored. A central church plan design was favored over the cross plan design. It usually consists of square with a central dome. The major axis is vertical, symbolizing earth and heaven. So I think this, well, they both really show you that. You have like a square base. This one has, maybe looks like an octagon base with this kind of more dome thing on top of it. But it's more of a central, well, that's why it says central church plan. It's more of like a round central thing. So hopefully you can get the idea of that. You're losing the cross plan. You're losing the long nave down the middle with the apse at the end. Do you see how it's different now? It's like a rounder open space in the middle is the majority of the building. So these would be a couple of very Byzantine churches to kind of have in your mind. You don't have to write down anything for those. I didn't give you any information, but just to give you a visual of what those types of churches look like. Okay, so we're leaving Byzantium, which, as the video really explained, the quote Middle Ages kind of encompasses Byzantium as well, and then clear forward through right to the edge of the Renaissance, which is the next major time period. But we're breaking it down a little bit further. We're kind of breaking these down so far. We've done early Christian, Byzantine, or Byzantium, and then now we're going into the early Middle Ages. So we're breaking it down into those time periods. Again, the lines are fuzzy, but so in the early Middle Ages, the kingdoms of the Middle Ages in Europe were occupied by descendants of migratory tribes that had traveled southward and westward across the continent during the 4th and 5th centuries. If you can get your mind around that, that takes a second to really think about. Picture Europe, which is where we're at. That's really the core of the Middle Ages as far as art that we're going to be talking about. So we're in Europe, and we have descendants of migratory tribes that had traveled southward. So this is coming from like the north, like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Germany. They're coming down from the north, and then we have people coming from the east. We have Islamic cultures that are coming from the east, and they're all converging here in Europe. And that's the reason you need to understand that, is just to see that there is a lot of influence, cultural influence, that comes from outside sources, outside regions, and that's why the art looks the way it does. It's influenced by those peoples that have come, bringing their own style of art and culture. So we're talking 400, 500 AD, right? 4th and 5th centuries. Those people migrated during that time period. So this is hundreds of years forming, but you get this underlying style of art that comes through. One of those underlying styles of art that comes through is the animal style. So this is motifs based in animal forms used as a part of delicately made designs. I don't know exactly why they used animals, other than, animals had always been a form of livelihood, survival, by more nomadic, earlier cultures that were surviving just on hunting. And so there's perhaps some ritualistic, superstitious connection with the animal style. And I'm going to show you an example of each of these in 1 second. And then interlace is this looking patterns formed by intricately woven ribbons and bands. Lace being your key word there, like that can help you remember it, is when you see this, here I go, sort of lacy looking stuff, that will be considered interlace. So here, this purse cover, which, what would a purse cover have been used for? Let me look real quick. So this is a discovered at a burial site, and it has this gold and enamel purse cover. Doesn't really tell us what the purse would actually be for. And it has gold garnets. It's 7.5 inches long. But the motifs on it, remember, a motif means like a repeated design, are typical. This is an animal style. Can you see the little animals there within it? It's something that came from northwestern Europe at the time, a legacy very likely from migratory herdsmen who were these people's ancestors. Animal style images were often accompanied by interlace. So there's our second type of decoration you see there, which are patterns, as I mentioned in the earlier slide. Interwoven ribbons and bands. And then this is an illumination, or illustration is what an illumination basically is, from the Gospel of Matthew, a book. And if you're watching the video, you noticed this was a huge art form, was illustrations of the Bible, and like elaborate drawings and paintings of different scenes that would go along with text. And so this one is just almost like the beginning of it, like maybe the first letter for the Bible in the book of Matthew, But it does show lots of that interlacing style. You see how it's like bands and ribbons woven within? It almost does look like lace. This right here is interlacing. And then this is the animal style that they were talking about. And the video also showed several examples of popular animal themes that you would see in artwork from those Germanic tribes that were passed down. So these are from 625, and this one's from 800, to give you an idea of time period. So continuing on with early Middle Ages, among the most important artistic products of the early Middle Ages were copies of Christian scripture, as I just alluded to. In the days before the printing press, each book had to be copied by hand. This was completed by monks working in monasteries. So an illumination, as I said before, is basically, I think of it as illustration and decorations. That's the big idea there. So the monks would copy word for word by hand the Bible, but they also illuminated. So these monks were also artists, weren't they? Furnishing them with illustrations and decorations. Only the wealthiest of the wealthy could afford to have one of these illuminated books. They were definitely became like a status symbol, a family treasure when you could have one. Not many people did, and at this time, not many people could read anyway. Nobody could, the average person couldn't read. They would have no idea what the book even said if they could read. Or because they couldn't read, sorry. Okay, so now notice that we're leaving the early Middle Ages and we're going into the high Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is such a long time period. It started around, or even actually did begin, 476, and that would be with the defeat of the last Western Roman emperor. Remember, there's two empires now. We have the Eastern and the Western, and Byzantine is associated with the Eastern Empire. So when the last Roman emperor was defeated in 476, that really marks the beginning of this Middle Age time period. And then it continued all the way to the time period of the Renaissance, which was in the 15th century, 1500s. So it's a long stretch, and it was a dark time. It was, people were not educated. But when we look at the art and other aspects of it as well, just the history in general, it's just rich with human invention, exploration. Just the things that happened during that time period are fascinating. It's not just a time of ignorance, really, even though people were not educated. So, as I said, this is moving on towards the high Middle Ages, which was really just, if Christianity and religious observance wasn't big before, it's really big now. It was like a preoccupation for the people of this time period. This is really the time period when most of the great cathedrals that we see in Europe were built. So the high Middle Ages, we would, and you probably heard them a couple of times reference in the video, the Romanesque time period. So the high Middle Ages has the Romanesque, which lasted from about 1050 to 1200 AD. That would be called the Romanesque. We're going to go through these. I think I have slides on all these. And then the Gothic would be from 1200 to the 15th century. So prior to the high Middle Ages is just kind of that more just getting going into this Middle Age art style. But now that we're in the high Middle Ages, we can really start to see some fantastic examples of art made. And as it says, a majority of the art associated with this time period comes from monasteries, churches, and cathedrals. just isn't a lot of other types of art during that time. Wealthy people could have portraits made of them. That's always a thing throughout history. So there is that, but otherwise it's pretty much religious context. And as I said, they divided into Romanesque and Gothic. There's the words for you to copy. So let's look at Romanesque. There's your dates that I quoted just a second ago, 1050 to 1200, based on Southern styles of the old Roman Empire. That's important, and that's why you hear Romanesque in there, because the old Roman Empire influence came back. And churches that you see built at this time are going to be massive, thick stone walls, round arches, and barrel vaulted ceilings. And they said that in the video, and they showed you examples as well. But some of that stuff we talked about in Roman art is coming back. Marked by a building boom caused by the popularity of religious pilgrimages. People came to these massive, thick, just enormous cathedrals and churches. They would come from around the area to partake of these religious ceremonies and experiences together as Christians. So we just see many, many of these types of buildings built at this time. Really, these could be examples too of that. Okay, so here, though, just to give you another visual of a church, this is Santa Fe, and look at the date, 1050. So right at the beginning of the High Middle Ages, right at the beginning or at the time period of the Romanesque style. This one is so great because it shows you it is going back to that cross plan very obviously. Can you see it? Here's the central piece. Here's the apse sticking out. Here's the transept that goes across and makes that cross plan. If you walked inside this building, you would see archway through here. All this would create arches. We looked at the Roman arch back when we talked of Rome. So you'd see all that again. Very heavy, very thick stone walls. And the inside would also have a lot of art. Be very much decorated with images, paintings, frescoes, probably some stained glass in there too, but that's going to come more during the Gothic period. So if you're feeling confused on your time periods, remember, you have, let me go back to this first slide. Remember, you have High Middle Ages, and these are like subcategories within that. So you have the first half is Romanesque of the High Middle Ages, and the second half will be Gothic. So for Gothic, the second half, we have 1200 and then into the 15th century, so 1500s. Inspired by early Christian writings, an ideal church should have certain characteristics. And so this is it's not biblical. It's just what people kind of over time came to this belief. And then you see the evidence of that in the architecture. So these early Christian writings had this feel or this essence of promoting appearing to reach to heaven, harmonious proportions, and filled with light. They thought those things, those characteristics, were very divine and awe-inspiring. And that's what a church should have. So they kind of went away from those heavy, more stocky-looking Romanesque style cathedrals, and you start to get into this Gothic style that looks like this. This is Chartres Cathedral, just one of many, many, many Gothic style churches you can find in Europe and cathedrals. This is 1134 to 1260. I think my wording here is a little messed up, so let me tell you what it says. Oh, I see. This is a very interesting example of architecture because down here at the bottom you'll see it says built over time, so it contains both Romanesque and Gothic styles. So that is really interesting. Different parts of it have the different styles, and even in this detail that you see here of some of the statues, let's see. This Romanesque one, do you see how they are more thick, stiff, a little more not protruding out from the thing that they're being carved from very much. So it is definitely high relief sculpture. It's still sticking out a lot. It's not bas relief, but it is a little more almost like they were a tube, like a pillar, and they just carved it out from that, but didn't give it a lot of form that way. Whereas this one on just same building, just a different facade, this one's on the west facade, and the Gothic is on the south transept, I believe, is what that's saying. And you can just see a dramatic difference in how they look. Much more naturalistic. Look how they're standing in a more naturalistic way, how their hands are expressive, and their weight is even shifted. You can even see how the weight, especially of this guy, he's kind of in that contrapposto pose, isn't he? Where these are just very stiff. Not as much detail carving like in the body. You don't get the sense of their bodies under those garments. You just kind of see like almost cylinders. Where these, you get a little more sense of that there's a human body under the clothing. So just to clarify, since my dates and stuff here are kind of messed up. The Romanesque one is the door jamb statues on the west facade of Chartres Cathedral, 1145 to 70 will be the date. And then we have the title of this one, of this Gothic one, is the Saints Theodora, Stephen, Clement, and Lawrence, and those are also door jambs on the south transept of Chartres Cathedral, and those were made in the 13th century. So a few hundred years, just a little, not tons of time between them, but a couple hundred years difference. Because if you look at the size of this thing, it's not hard to understand that it would have taken a long, long time to build it. Well, it happened to be built when the art style was shifting from Romanesque to Gothic, and so you get this sort of mixture of styles. And then a really interesting thing is the spires are different. They are not, this one's under construction when this photograph was taken, but they are not the same. They're not symmetrical, which is really interesting. So hopefully you can see that difference and that change over time. Just think of Romanesque as stiffer, simpler, heavy. Think of Gothic as lighter, heaven-reaching, more expressive, and a bit more detailed, more naturalistic, both in architecture and in sculpture and painting as well. Okay, now we're going towards the Renaissance. So we're reaching the end of the Middle Ages, which you could see hundreds of artworks and examples of the Middle Ages, which that's why I like those videos, is they do give you a lot more visuals than we have in the time we have together in these PowerPoints. But it was a long time period, and there was a lot of art. We even didn't even talk about stained glass windows, which was a huge part of the Middle Ages, the golden age of stained glass. This Chartres Cathedral has an example right here of a rose window, which is a very popular, and almost every Gothic cathedral would have a rose window like that. And from the inside, the stained glass was just incredible. Okay, so going towards the Renaissance, painter Giotto represents a tradition from the Middle Age style of art to the Renaissance. Because as I said, no time period just stops dead in its tracks and totally changes. Although we've kind of seen some evidence of how dramatic it can change between styles. But this painter Giotto represents a style that kind of falls in between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So we're going to see a more naturalistic and representational depiction of the physical world in this painting called The Lamentation. The date on it is 1305 to 1306, and so we're almost to the Renaissance. It said 15th century, so that would be like 1400s is the true beginning of the early Renaissance. And this is just in that transitional time period between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So what do we see here? Several things that make it not just your traditional early Christian, Byzantine, or even Middle Age style art. A shift has happened where we start to feel like we're almost looking at a scene being acted out on a stage. Can you see that? Some interesting things that this artist is doing, like this guy's back is to us. This, we see, so just even the positioning is more naturalistic. There's overlap of this guy or woman overlapping Christ as he weeps for him. But his back is to us. Well, that's an interesting technique, isn't it? It makes us feel like this is really happening and we're just looking into a window of a scene happening or a time period. We have lots of overlap. We have lots of directional cues, like they're looking. We talked about that when we talked about line. Implied lines, aren't they? Let's talk about that for a second. Look at all the implied lines. Where do you think the emphasis is? Emphasis and the focus is on Jesus. You have their eyes all looking towards Jesus. You have this dramatic diagonal line. Remember we talked about that. The diagonals add tension, motion, and they also certainly create a point of view or a directional cue as to where we should look at. But the body positions are much more naturalistic, have some emotion. Even the way this guy's standing right here, it's just kind of like he's just solemnly standing there in his naturalistic pose with his hands crossed and the weight on his feet, how he's standing. It's just a different, more human, less stiff way of representing people. If you can, and more realistic. If you think back to how that image of Princess Theodora looked, the mosaic, or think back to the video when it showed images of those paintings on the walls of the burial chambers for the early Christianity. They just did not, they looked weirder. They looked more cartoon-like and just not as naturalistic. So this is a change that's coming. And Giotto represents an artist in that shifting over. So that really ends our section on, we've covered a wide range of time periods here, from early Christian to Byzantine to Middle Ages, both early and high, and then now we're pushing towards the Renaissance. And so the whole next chapter, chapter 16, is just the Renaissance, and we will cover that next time.